So we had a CEO of UnitedHealthcare was gunned down in the street, and the reactions to this have been very surprising. Not just for the sake of that, it seems that a lot of people don't have much remorse for what has happened here, but rather the sentiment around people being extremely upset about the way this company had been running its practices with respect to claims. That there were a lot of people who feel that their claims have been denied incorrectly, and if you look at the way that this individual is being compensated, it sure seems like he was profiting off the pain and suffering of many. And to me, that seems like we're on the precipice of what exactly happened during the French Revolution, when you push people to the point where they really don't have anything left to lose, and they start taking very dramatic actions against the only people that they really see as being their oppressors. Lucas, I'm interested to hear your take on where we're at in American society, if this is what's going on.
Well, my first thought in this is, in preparation, in the last couple of minutes before this show, I pulled up a Google window and I put a D in the search bar, and the phrase that popped up immediately was deny, defend, depose. And those were the words that were scratched on the casings of the bullets that were used. So we don't know, I think maybe we should start out with what we do and what we don't know with this. We know that the man who was killed was the CEO of UnitedHealthcare. We know that there was a,
which is one of the what is it, most profitable companies in the world, I believe.
I don't know about its profits. I know I've seen more information with regards to its denial rates, and more broadly.
Well, I'm pretty sure. Let me fact check that real quick while we're talking. But keep going.
Well, what I do know about it is, and about insurance more broadly, and what everybody knows about insurance, is that one of their first lines of in dealing with their customers is to deny a claim. And when this first happened, my immediate thought was, how many claims denied does it take to have a bad outcome with a patient? And also, I'll add some context for our listeners. I saw this coming out of the hospital, and after being in the hospital with a relative who has been stuck in a hospital, as the doctors of that hospital fight with the insurance company, because they say that a certain level of convalescent care should be met if they are to release my relative from their care, and the insurance company says they don't need that, they can go home. We can provide that in some other fashion through home health care. And so when this happened, my immediate thought was, how many claims have they denied? What's the chance that somebody was denied coverage and had a disastrous effect, died probably, and there was an upset family member, whose mother died because
Well,
they were.
I think that's partially what people have been talking about with respect to this situation, is who potentially would have been a suspect in this case. And there's just so many suspects, because if you think about the practices of this business and the way it's been operated, if you start denying a lot of claims and using technology, which has known error rates, is helping you automate the process of denying claims, you start to think about the size of the suspect pool. It's approaching the entire U.S. populace.
It's massive. And I mean, yeah, you bring up also the automation, the lack of human interaction, the lack of empathy that exists in the system. I think that's part of the problem here, and why I make the assumption that this has something to do, like, more broadly with the insurance sector. And so that's what I want to have a conversation about. And I think that
Well,
the
let's go there in 2 seconds. So a couple other things I want to bring up just real quick because I've been watching the left-leaning site Reddit about this because they've pretty much been all over this, and I think that there was one thread that sort of really caught my attention. And I think with Reddit, the most important thing is to go through and look through the comments and what people are saying. And so this one is talking about, well, the leadership pages were taken down of other major leading health insurance companies. And to me, this says that these other companies are starting to realize how much they've impacted the lives of the average American and how much they potentially are at risk for having done this. I mean, I don't know if they didn't have a sense of this already. I mean, how could you not realize that denying these claims and causing massive amount of pain and suffering within the United States, that you wouldn't have some sort of a backlash against that at some point? And when the US populace is starting to get to the point where they feel like they can't live because they're not making enough money, because inflation has impacted their quality of life to an extent that like they can't make rent and pay their bills and put anything in their pocket, and we're starting to see people not be able to live in their homes because they're having to start to make trade-offs, that people feel like they don't have anything left to lose, and now they're going to start to inflict an equivalent amount of pain and suffering on the people that they feel have wronged them. I think that this is a very dangerous point in society to be at, where you have a lot of people who feel like they don't have anything left to lose.
violence violence shares the same root as violent, and violence in the history of the word actually means change, and we take it now as coercion or um hurting someone. But violence is also, in a way, people desperate for change. um and I think this is more broadly about the insurance industry, about where we are politically. I think this has everything. I think the position that the insurance industry is in, and the reason that they are denying so many claims, is due in part to what they can get away with, but also is set up with an assumption that that they don't know what the effects of inflation are, and if they don't know, or if they can't make predictions about what the prices are in the future, then they might as well start denying as many claims as they can, in order to have a treasure chest in which they can pay out whenever they do have to pay out for a claim.
Well, see, now that's the interesting part of this entire situation is if UnitedHealthcare, which I flashed it on the screen briefly, so I don't know if you saw it, but like was the most profitable healthcare company. I think if you were to stack this against all of their companies, they'd be high up on the list. I don't know if they're the most profitable company in the world, but they are the most profitable healthcare company in the world. So you have to ask yourself, where is all of those billions of dollars going, and like how much of the claims that they're denying are the end result of them being able to have this shareholder value and this profitability? Because insurance in some ways seems like a pretty simple calculus. There's complexity, and I know that we're going to get into this in a second, because as we've discussed and as we should discuss in this show, inflation has a significant component to what you have to do when you're calculating out insurance. But if you're just taking in the money from all of the insurance premiums that are being paid, everybody's paying in a certain amount every month, and you put that money in a big pile and you use it to calculate against the liabilities, that should be a pretty simple thing to do and say, all right, well, we should be paying out the majority of the money that's coming in on a regular basis, because the insurance premiums reflect whatever the cost of care is, and we have a way to calculate this all up. But it seems like what's happening instead is that money's coming into a big pile, and most of it's going into the pockets of the executives or the shareholders or whatever. And so you have to do a lot of this denial of claims because the money is all being stolen from what should have been just being put as an offset against the liabilities. I mean, maybe I'm thinking about it too naively, but it sure seems like that's what's happening here.
No, that's exactly what's happening. And maybe the CEO and those people who work in insurance understand what's going on, but you know, insurance insurance is part of an economic revolution that comes to us in the wake of the 30s. And it's part of an understanding that you can manipulate and control the economy by fixing prices. So if we go back to what FDR did coming out of the Great Depression, and we remember in our minds that the Great Depression was not about famine, it wasn't about drought, it was about a lack of money and people not being able to, farmers not being able to sell their wheat, not to sell their sheep, people who were making furniture or cars not being able to sell those items. The market froze up because there was no trust that existed, and the government realized that they could start to set prices by establishing insurance. And 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 part of that understanding too came from a realization that they, in a partial reserve system, that they could create money, that they could lie about the amount of money that existed as long as prices were stable. And so they created this concept of insurance and said, we'll guarantee the price of something now. And they were backing it up by creating money to pay it off into the future. And that's an okay thing to do if you're part of a government. But whenever it gets into the private sector, those people who believe that that is reality, or that they are not taking advantage of somebody along the way, are caught in a trap. And so they can either go bankrupt trying to play the game according to the rules that they are told exist, or they can cheat. And they've been cheating their customers in order to, and part of the trap of that is, well, once you've abandoned the moral high ground, and you've denied somebody, why not deny everybody? And if you know that it's a fraud to begin with, you can run off with you know the cash before the scheme comes crashing down. So yeah,
And now that we have, this mandate that pretty much everybody has to have insurance, or at least the mandate was in place for a certain period of time, and we established some amount of, like, I don't know, making healthcare something that everybody thought they needed to have, or that they decided that they needed to have, and it significantly shifted the insurance game. Because I remember when this was more of a perk, and health insurance was seen as something that you didn't necessarily need, but it was a good thing to sort of cover your ass in the event that you got some kind of a catastrophic thing. But as the health of America has degenerated over time, it is seen like more of a necessity, because almost everybody's on medication, almost everybody is suffering from some kind of a malady. And I think this is partly what Kennedy's been talking about. He said, what has happened, what has really gone on over the last 30, 40 years that has caused this rapid decline of American health. And he's pointed at a variety of different things, whether he's right or wrong. I think it's hard to deny the fact that America is pretty sick right now. And if that means that most people need health care, there's been injected a lot of costs into the situation. And so now you have these insurance companies which have realized how much cost there is, have risen these premiums, and then absconded with the cash. So now they're in a situation where they're convincing themselves that they're in a situation where they've got to keep these prices really low. And I threw on the screen the Supreme Court ruling Dodge versus Ford that says, these CEOs and these companies are required to maximize shareholder value and don't have to think about the morality of what they're actually doing. And that means, you can pollute the environment or deny claims for sick people, and that's all well and good because you're just maximizing shareholder value. And I think that this is another dangerous thing for society to be in, is where these companies, which are so huge, are doing this kind of a thing.
So I like pay attention to the date of this Supreme Court case, 1919, or this decision. And think in your mind too about this being a response to the monopolization that's granted to the creditors. And so once we've abandoned the notion, or once we've given a monopoly to the creation of money, we have a long history of pretending that we live in a capitalist society, while meanwhile binding debtors um, to the tricks that are played onto them by creditors, whether it be a person or a company. So you also mentioned hospitals, and I think this, like everything is the corruptness of this system is really exposed when it comes to insurance, um, because of I don't because we don't have the option. It's not like looking at a car and saying, well, I can do without that. If you have appendicitis, you need an appendectomy. There are times whenever you need care. If you run your hand through a table saw, you need to go to the hospital and you need to get that fixed. And so this notion of this being about a choice, that capitalism is about the choice and the preferences of buyers, kind of falls away. Now, hospitals up until Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, um, in which we in some ways nationalized insurance. Um, you know, if we think back to how hospitals worked before, and maybe for a long time before that, every hospital that you go to is going to be associated with a church. In Amarillo, you have Baptist St. Anthony's. In Durango, you have St. Mary's. In just every hospital that you go to, if you start looking into it, it's probably going to go back to a religious institution. Well, what's important to know about religious institutions is that religion is largely about the forgiveness of debt. And there's many narratives that you can append to religion, but where it comes important with this concept of what do you owe is that they operated on forgiveness and could apply forgiveness and move forward and somehow continue to operate.
And that's probably one of the most missing words from our day-to-day language. It used to be part of, what was talked about pretty frequently, because a lot of Americans were attending church and hearing sermons and whatever, and forgiveness is a common theme. But now, as we've had kind of a moving away from that sort of activity by most Americans, like, you just don't hear that word. And so even things like the forgiveness of student loans is looked at very unfavorably by many, because it's like, I'm not getting mine kind of an attitude.
Oh, student loans is, if we look at the amount of household debt, the amount of debt that exists in student loans, and also those loans being given out by the federal government, you can really begin to understand why the Biden administration was so eager to find some way to introduce debt forgiveness into student loans.
Well, I mean, there's definitely a political calculus there. Whoever hands out the free cheese definitely has a substantive advantage. If you give away a lot of free cheese, it's a way to buy votes in some sense. But I think I have a lot of sympathy for people who have been paying on their student loans for a substantive amount of time and don't feel like they've made any real progress towards it. And if it's the federal government that's just printing money and most of the loan principal has already been recaptured, you really got to ask yourself why you're holding people in indentured servitude for eternity, and this is a non-dischargeable debt when they've taken on some sort of a loan that really didn't end up helping them. You get a liberal arts degree and you pay $200,000 for it, like, yes, you've made a foolish decision, but it's a foolish decision you've made at one of the most, least amount of information times in your life, and you probably didn't really understand what you were taking on or the full extent of what it was going to mean in your life. And not being able to even discharge it in bankruptcy means that that's a millstone that lives around your neck for forever. It's a very unfair kind of a situation, and it's also led to a dramatic rise in the cost of higher education, just because the whole system is set up in such a fashion.
Well, is it the student that's foolish for getting a liberal arts degree, or is it the schools that are foolish for charging these and expecting that the students are going to be able to pay them back? No, nobody's foolish, because the government's paying for it on both sides. Or a lot of students understand that they don't have to pay back a lot of that, and that the interest is canceled whenever they're out of a job. Anyway, let's go back to healthcare. Although I think also both of these are interesting cases that point to a broader problem that we're having in our society. So, you know, what are some of the in I should just say in education, the government's providing the loans, and the schools are raising their prices, so they continue to because the government is backing them up. Well, what happened in healthcare with the Affordable Care Act? All of a sudden, you have a deal that's cut between um, the healthcare professional lobby and the insurance providers, and it says, "Oh, well, we're going to make sure that everybody has insurance, and the insurance is going to cover the costs." So now, where as in the past, there was some sort of notion of forgiveness, or maybe people aren't going to pay me back, and that kept down healthcare costs. In the wake of the Affordable Care Act, there's a promise to pay, and and
Yeah, the
and
pre-existing condition thing was that's been pointed to as one of the drivers. It's like it used to be a lock-in thing. Yeah, you wouldn't try to change carriers or change jobs or whatever, because if you had that pre-existing condition, you could be denied from a new insurance company. But now insurance companies are looking at every new subscription as a potential, like major cost center. And with the way that health treatment costs have increased, you could be looking at $1 million or $10 million liability by taking on a certain individual. And so, I mean, there is part of this in the calculus, but
well, and the pre-existing conditions, know, may have given consumers the ability to select and join more preferential pools, but again, at the base of this, I think there are mistaken expectations as to how the system is to work. If we require care, and we believe in a system that operates on the assumption of choice, then what have insurance companies been set up to do? But if they're not going to deny their coverage to people beforehand, then they have to deny it afterwards. And once you open up that expectation to say, oh, well, they had to take everybody on, people are going to try to gain the system and use the insurance company, and not just patients, but I mean, think of what doctors do, and think of how our medical system has become one of an interminable number of appointments, and God
well,
forbid you do.
it's set up a bit of an adversarial situation between doctors that earnestly want to help patients and provide care, but then there's also this very shady kind of stuff that sometimes can occur, even in the light of things that have been tried to been done to curb this, like the Sunshine Act and whatever. It's very difficult to kind of untangle all of this stuff and to make it fair and to make it reasonable. But there's at least an adversarial situation between the insurance company and the healthcare providers that are trying to do their job well and are watching things be denied, when it seems fairly obvious that certain things should just go through, and now they have to have these fights about whether the things that they're prescribing and the things that they're saying should be done for the patients are in their best interest and are in the best interest of society.
Well, and now to compound all of this, because doctors have to pay for education. Going back to that education, hospitals have to pay for all of their healthcare workers, and with the introduction of government regulations into this sphere, and remember too, what is the difference between, say, our expectations of government and our expectations of religious, and that being founded on some notion of forgiveness? With the government, we have all of a sudden this expectation of, if I'm not treated at the same level, or my safety is not insured, then we have concepts of liability, and I'm going to try to take advantage of that system. So we've driven up the expectation of costs and fault to everybody around, and so we have clinics or hospitals that, instead of doing 4 or 5 operations or procedures at once, they're going to break it all up. Why are they going to break it up? Because the government said, that's the safest route. It gets complicated if you bring somebody in here and you do 4 things at once.
Well, I mean, and you had mentioned that a lot of healthcare providers used to be tied to churches, and I think that this is another one where, looking at Dodge versus Ford, when you have for-profit hospitals and they're trying to maximize shareholder value, they've got an incentive to try to break things up and play the game with the insurance companies and the government, and it's kind of this for-profit thing all around, and we got to ask ourselves if is this really what we want as a society? Is this in the best interest of everybody? Like, how is this really the best? I mean, you can say, well, a for-profit hospital that's trying to drive as much profit as possible is going to deliver the best care. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case.
So, and absolutely not. And again, going back to the case that we have here in 1919, this comes in the wake of doling out a monopoly to the the banking system, and immediately underneath the banking or the monetary system is the financial system. And so we have given a monopoly to the creditors, and we have not questioned how that impacts debtors, where we have forgiveness that exists in society. This is not just in the insurance. We're seeing this we're seeing the violence of the assassination of a CEO of an insurance company, not because this is isolated to insurance and to healthcare, but because of like the outsized impact, and probably somebody doesn't have a lot to lose. But this is occurring in houses. This is occurring in housing. This is occurring in the cost of transportation, the cost of energy.
It's widespread. It's ubiquitous, and I think that a lot of people that have profited, handsomely, are going to have to start being pretty concerned about this. Like, their ability to live freely in society is likely to be called into question. There's a lot of information out there that exists, and to the extent that people are feeling very disaffected, this is a very well-armed society, and it's when you have nothing left to lose, you're going to start to see society start to break down. You have to have people feel like they have a stake in society, and I feel like we're reaching the point where a lot of people feel like they don't anymore have a stake in society.
Well, the Biden administrations. Let's talk about some of the political some of the ways this could be addressed. The Biden administration seemed to want to address it or seem to come up with no other way than to print more money to pay everybody off. And yet, when people are aware that the supply of money is being increased, and there's no more faith in the setting of prices or the stability of prices, that system begins to crumble. Now, the Trump administration turns around and says, the way that we're going to fix this is to make other people pay. Mexico's going to pay for the wall. Like now that gets brought to us in terms of tariffs, like, oh, we're not going to raise your taxes, we're going to lower your taxes because somebody else is going to pay for your taxes. And meanwhile, we love capitalism. Well, at some point, we need to understand that capitalism is about letting people and institutions fail. And part of letting something fail involves a concept of forgiveness. And if we have a society in which the creditor has all the power and no debt is ever canceled, then we are going to wind up in a place of violence. A tyrant, according to Cicero, and going back to everybody who loves their Roman history.
I mean, I love it when you can tie in these things. I mean, to me, it's one of the most fascinating things. It's like let's bring up as much historical context as we can, because if there's anything that Americans lack, it's historical perspective. So bring it on, man. This is great.
Well, Cicero says, as the people of Rome are revolting against the ruling class, he says a tyrant is the forgiver of debts. And what it means to be a tyrant is to take things from the rich and give them to the poor. And so it's interesting that we have this, like listen also to the political discussion of authoritarianism that exists in the world today, and be very wary of lambasting authoritarianism. Everybody loved Nayib Bukele whenever he introduced the Bitcoin and a fixed supply of money into El Salvador. But when he started talking about fixing prices or telling the grocery stores that they couldn't overcharge because he knew what the supply of money was in the country, and that they were taking advantage of the knowledge of the individual people who were coming to buy their items there, um, American and Western European journalists couldn't stop writing authoritarianism. He's trying to tell people what to do. So we need to be very wary of falling a trap to, people will behave in not your best interest, and that doesn't necessarily just mean the person who's at the top or a ruler. And it's one thing to have the forgiveness of debts forced upon us by a tyrant, but if we want to get away from being forced into the forgiveness of debts, then we need to engage in it ourselves. Now, Beadle posted up in a comment earlier that there existed in the concept of Judaism the Jubilee, and that's 100% right. We used to have concepts of forgiveness that existed in all religions, but we go to the creation of the Roman Catholic Church 400 years after, and we like to talk about the Christians had a lower interest rate on their loans, but in Judaism, a loan was given out for a year, and debts were in many cases canceled because there are many tribes of Hebrew people. We refer to the stories of the family of Jacob as the one and only, but in some cases it was 7 years, in some cases it was most cases it was 1 year, in some cases it was talked about like, oh, let's move that to 50 years. Let's hold the debts of the debtor for 50 years. Oh, I don't think that worked out so well for him. But Christianity, what did the St. Augustine and the Catholic Church do? They said, we'll give a loan out for a month, but we don't want to give a loan out for a year because that's a long time to be indebted. So they gave a loan out for a month at a lower interest rate. But if you foreclose on somebody after a month instead of forgiving their debt after a year, that's a very different system. And we can begin to see the problems that were created in medieval Europe with that shorter window of a loan term, and and the practices of finance that the Catholic Church engaged in there. So we need to, it's interesting to me that in all of that conversation about student loans, in all of our conversations about household debt, or even the the sovereign debt of the United States and say Argentina, we never talk about debt cancellation. Everyone loves to talk about how great Javier Milei is doing in Argentina because he's he is reducing the amount of government spending. But if he was a really powerful person, he would forgive the debts of Argentina. But when the debts of Argentina are owed to the IMF and the World Bank, and there's the threat of seizing all of Argentina's property, or this possibly gives us the excuse to militarily invade another country, I think we need to be thinking about taking that off the table and returning to a notion of sovereignty and saying there's a there is a monetary system that exists. That is what sovereignty is. And whenever the people who engage in that system want to forgive debts, then they can do so. But
I don't think there's a lot of appetite for forgiveness of debts out there. It looks like what there is now is a lot of appetite for seizing the underlying assets associated with the debt collateralization. That to me seems like mostly what the World Bank and the IMF are interested in doing. And there's been some rumblings about this is what Ukraine's all about, right? Is that there's a certain amount of stuff that's there that are the interest of the world, and this is really what we're fighting over.
well, that's part of the narrative. But if I were in charge of one of the companies that engage in who are getting that money, I'd say no. We just need an excuse in order to create more loans. As we give all this money to Ukraine, who are we really giving it to? We're giving it to American companies that are making munitions. We're promising it to managers of assets and saying, oh, we're going to allow you to manage the assets of those countries. So we're really not taking things from all of those countries, but we're going again back to this notion coming out of the Great Depression of securing markets. So we're going to bind everybody into this one unilateral system. We're going to force them to use our money, so then we can rob from them little by little in rates, in the financial aspects of that monetary system. So this is where I also look at Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and say we're on the precipice of a very new world. And whenever we're getting away from this notion, this lie of fractional reserve lending, because we haven't engaged in fractional reserve lending for a long time, the amount of money the amount of paper money that we've created far exceeds what the value is, or both the expected value or the utilitarian value is for the assets that underpin them. And the system has continued to work. So what we need is better accounting, better stories that are told about what is owed and what is promised against different assets and between the two sides of party in an exchange.
Yeah. Fascinating concept. I hope for society that we don't end up in a situation where this starts to become the norm. I don't really want to live in a society where people are being gunned down in the streets and we're being assassinated. So my hopeful outcome for this is that we have some deep soul searching from CEOs of companies, and maybe even a challenge to this ruling that maybe there is a moral responsibility of companies, not just to maximize shareholder value, but maybe there's some moral high ground that is required from companies that, the pollution, the wanton pollution of the environment and the wholesale destruction of, the health of the populace. These aren't things that can be prioritized over the top of profits.
Well, the moment that we see a politician start talking about, uh, bringing student loans into bankruptcy, into consideration for bankruptcy, and what protections of assets exist during bankruptcy. In bankruptcy, should you be able to lose your home? Maybe if it's a massive 200-room mansion, maybe not. But what we need right now, or what I look for, I should say, are politicians that talk about bankruptcy. And we didn't hear it in the Biden administration. We haven't heard it yet in the Trump administration. But I think Donald Trump is well aware of the direness of the situation and looking for solutions. I don't know that the tariff solution is going to work. It starts because it begins to break apart the unilateral the reliance on one universal money, because people aren't going to participate in a money whenever it's better for Americans and not for them. So there's a start. But once we are isolated in the use of our money, then we need to immediately, or even before then, have politicians who understand that and understand how we're going to structure forgiveness.
Well, I think that's all the time we've got for today, and we'll see you next time on FoMO.
Yep. See you next week. Thanks for the comments, Boodle.